Okay, so this is a little presentation on the dative case. If we were in class together today on Monday in September, don't remember the date, then we've already seen this. If you weren't in class, this will be good news for you. We're going to talk about the dative case, which is the case of the indirect object. Now, there are 6 or 7 cases in Latin, depending on who you ask. We have learned 3 of them so far. The first one is the nominative. It's the case of the subject and the predicate of a copulative sentence. So we can have ego sum poeta or vir est meistus. These are, I am a poet, the man is sad. These are ways of either stating a subject or saying something about the subject. We also have learned that there's a case for showing possession. It's the genitive case. So if we want to say, I am the student of the poet, we can take poet and put it into the genitive. Or we could say the man's son is sad. We can put sad into the genitive. Sorry, not sad, but man, the man. We also learned the finite transitive verb recently, which means that we can use the accusative, which is the case of the direct object. So putting all of that together, all of those pieces of knowledge together, we can get a pretty complex sentence like this one. Filia naute puerum bellum amat. So the sailor's daughter loves the handsome boy. So, what's missing? What's missing is the indirect object. Some verbs in Latin, just like in English, allow the idea that something else will be affected by the action of the verb, but not directly. Not directly, but indirectly. In Latin, to signal this meaning, we use the dative case. So, we can say, puer rosas puella, puelle dat. The boy gives roses is the basic sentence. The boy is the subject, the roses are the direct object, and we wonder, is there a recipient of the roses? Can we specify that? We can. When we do that, we're using the indirect object. So we'll put puelle into the dative singular, feminine. So, as you may have noticed just from that example, the forms of the dative are frustratingly close and similar to some of the other forms that you already know. Latin isn't going to make things very easy for you, since each of the forms of the dative in the first and second declensions is identical to some other case in some other gender. So here they are. Notice in the feminine singular that the genitive and dative forms are the same, a. And that makes them both identical to the nominative plural. In the masculine and neuter singular, the dative is identical to the ablative. You don't know the ablative yet, but it's good to know now that the ablative and the dative of all masculine and neuter singular and plural forms of the second declension are identical. They are all is. So those are the forms. Good to know, good to learn. Now let's talk about the other ways to use the dative. The dative, just like the genitive and the accusative, is not just going to fill this one role in the meaning of a Latin sentence. The way that you conceive of how a dative is translated is often enough very similar to the translation of the genitive. You may not realize that when you say unus nautarum, for example, you are using the genitive of the whole. You're saying one of a number of sailors. You're not using possession. This is not a case of possession. And so this is one of those times where you're using the genitive not for the basic meaning of possession. It doesn't really matter, though, because you know that most of the time when you've got a form of the genitive, you can stick the word of into your translation, and it will most likely make sense in English. So even if you couldn't describe exactly what one of the sailors means in Latin or describe it as the genitive of the whole, you still successfully told me what the meaning of the sentence is. The same is usually true of the dative. You may be looking at a simple dative as an indirect object, like when I say, Lucius globum mihi iactat. Lucius throws the ball to me. You don't really need to know that the personal pronoun mihi is in the dative because it's in the indirect object. You could just try either to or for in front of the word me and see what the sentence sounds like. In this case, we'd say Lucius throws the ball to me. That happens to be an indirect object, but it doesn't really matter. As long as you can make it sound good in English, then that's generally what we're looking for. There are, though, at least two other uses of the dative that you need to be familiar with. There are several other uses of the dative. I won't require you to know all of them, but we're going to focus on two of them, just so you get a feel for what the dative is like. So one of the most common is the dative of possession. Now, you've already learned how to use the genitive to signal possession in a predicate construction. You can say, femina est viri, and you're literally saying the woman is of the man. But what you actually mean is the woman belongs to the man, as in they're married, or something like that. What Latin prefers in this situation much more, though, to signal possession is to use a form of to be plus what is possessed in the nominative and the possessor in the dative. So Latins would like to say femina est viro. Literally, the woman is to the man. In this case, the translation belongs to is the best. And the reason for that is because we get to keep the word to. The woman belongs to the man. It reminds us that viro is in the dative. But you could also translate it as the man has a wife, or the woman belongs to the man, something like that. You can also use the dative of possession to tell someone what your name is. So, mihi nomen est Lucius means my name is Lucius. Literally, to me, the name is Lucius. So that's the dative of possession. And then the other one that we want to focus on is actually a pretty broad category of dative. It's a special use of the dative called the dative of reference. And there are a lot of subcategories of it. And again, don't get bogged down in the idea that of being able to label specifically any of these examples. You just need to know that there's such a thing called the dative of reference. And it would be good for you to begin to recognize this sort of usage when you see a dative. So a dative of reference really just usually tells the reader what advantage or disadvantage someone has in regards to the action of the sentence, or what benefit, or what is being referred to when the action of a sentence happens. So this first one, rosas filiae vendidi, I bought roses for my daughter. So I bought them on behalf of her. I bought them for her benefit because she likes flowers. Laborat sibi means he works for himself. He works for his own advantage. He has a self-owned business, and whenever he works, he makes money for himself. That'd be a dative of advantage, and that's a kind of dative of reference. You could also say something like mihi Latinum debimus dicere, which is, in my opinion, we should learn Latin. That'd be a dative of person judging, because there's someone giving their opinion, and the person whose opinion is being heard is in the dative. It's the opinion of me that people should learn Latin. And then you can also have something of the shows you the position of something in reference to something else. It's a really literal local dative of reference. So ambulas in agro edificio. You're walking the field next to the house. So we're saying in the field, which field? Where is the field in reference to something else? And the thing we're saying that it's in reference to is the building, the edificio. So that's just a few examples of the dative of reference. In fact, you'll usually be able to use the word for to translate a dative of reference. But in fact, you may have to introduce another phrase or preposition entirely just to make sense of it. It won't be too hard. I won't be too hard on you to need to identify these kinds of constructions, but you need to know that they exist, and that Latin uses them quite a bit. So that's the dative.